the election result is not what I'm concerned about. It's the rationality of it that concerns me. I fear that this is only about to get worse in our political culture, because our political culture is becoming more managerial, more focus group driven, and less about ideas. And one of the reasons for this, and this is the great paradox of our time, is that we have an all-pervasive political media. You can't escape it now. There's 24-hour news channels. Newspapers don't produce newspapers anymore. They produce websites and they attach a newspaper to it. And some people leave newspapers for websites, because this is, and that's not a criticism, this is the emerging way that political media and reporting is done. The thing about it, having a 24-hour news channel, is you got to fill 24 hours. How do you do that? Well, it's very, very hard to fill that space with ideas. Really hard. Because you've got to find people who have them. Or people who don't have them but know about them and can talk about them. What we're getting instead, in the drive to feed this beast that is ever present, is a focus on politics as a game. I've said elsewhere, we in this country, and this might be more true in Melbourne than here, but I think it's true everywhere, in this country we do politics as though it's sport, and we do sport as though it's politics. We report on politics by trying to figure out who's winning, who's losing, who won this, was this politically good, did this position them well. And we talk about sport as though ideas really matter. Player management philosophies. All sorts of psychological questions that get discussed. This is highbrow stuff. And that's where you find ideas in the newspapers, the back pages. You go to the... In the political coverage, we don't do that. We just don't. And I think there are two reasons for that. One is the thing I've alluded to, that in a 24-hour news environment, it's much easier to conduct a poll and then spend the rest of the day discussing the poll. Think about that fact. This is an observation that someone from the UK made to me who works in media. He said he was astonished by how frequently an opinion poll is the lead item on a news bulletin in this country. It's not news. It's a poll. Nothing happened. So that's point number one. But not of the whole. But that's one effect of the media cycle. But the other thing is that as politics has become more pervasive, it's become necessarily more populist, because politicians then have to respond to the media cycle where they need to fit into the structure that exists. And that means that ideas don't work. And one of the things that I am really frustrated about are the number of people saying, I'm so sick of politics being negative, I'm so sick of politicians just throwing grenades at one another and then going to the ballot box and rewarding exactly that behaviour. And for those of you, and I've heard so many people say this to me since the election result, who are upset, for instance, at the way the coalition is behaving and say, I just wish that Malcolm Turnbull was the leader of the coalition. Let me say this to you. If Malcolm Turnbull was the leader of the coalition, Kevin Rudd would be Prime Minister now, probably with an increased majority. We would have an ETS. Kevin Rudd's great moral challenge would have been met, and he would have been a Supreme Prime Minister who'd achieved a reform. And Malcolm Turnbull, who would have negotiated a package and helped usher it through for the benefit of the country, would be on the scrap heap of the Liberal Party. We reward adversarial political behaviour. And we do that because we interact with it through a structure in 24-hour media that facilitates that. And we have such a concern with bias in media that there is nowhere to go for a political commentator who wants to discuss ideas, because the only way to maintain neutrality, which is a key commodity for a journalist now, the only way to maintain neutrality is to avoid discussing ideas and discuss the scoreboard. Is the mining tax a good idea? I don't want to talk about that, but it's going to hurt them electorally in these seats. Now, I don't blame journalists for that. This is a structural problem, and it's for that reason I'm not convinced that we will escape it. And on that cheery note, I'll end.
Thank you, Waleed. He has, however, violated a tenet of this panel discussion, which is that you have to insult the profession of the next speaker. And instead he has gone straight for the journalistic jugular. And Miriam has escaped miraculously. So I will hand over to Miriam, who I'm hoping will talk to us to a degree about some of the ideas that she thinks Australia needs, but also that process of alchemy by which ideas can or cannot become policy and enter that process of interacting with government and making things happen.
Thanks, Anne. So I have a similarly cynical analysis to Waleed, but I think a slightly more hopeful conclusion. But I do just want to start off with a confession that's kind of related to my profession. I work for a policy think tank. It has the word policy in its name. When I was at uni and I was a sort of idealistic, world-changing kind of aspirant, I avoided all of the subjects in my political science degree that had the word policy in the name. And I actually ended up organising ideas, festivals and ideas-based events that were all about trying to involve more of the uni student crowd in debates about important policy issues. We just never used the word policy. And that kind of relates, I guess, to a point that Elizabeth was making about our anti-intellectualism. I think perhaps Australia is anti-intellectual. I'm not sure that we're anti-ideas. I think that that's a slightly different thing. And I think that the political culture in Australia has become so insular, partly because of the things that Waleed was talking about, the idea that, actually journalists are part of the news and we have a weekly program called The Insiders, which is about journalists as part of an inner circle where that politics and policy is all wrapped up in Canberra and it's not a place that you see as being part of the general community. I think that is what in many ways stifles the potential broader embrace of ideas and ideas debates in this country. So, when there are media platforms that give ordinary people a chance to actually talk about ideas that they care about, they tend to be really, really popular. And that's whether that's talkback radio or whether it's on ABC shows like The New Inventors or Q&A, really highly rating shows. So that's just a little note of hope that I wanted to inject there, I guess, about the prospect for ideas as a broader, more participatory and more inclusive kind of discussion. So the organisation that I work for, it's all about making good ideas matter. We're about 3 years old now. We've published lots and lots and lots of policy ideas. I think about 1.5 have got up so far. So I need to obviously in this context look for a bit of an excuse for that because they were good ideas, right? So I'm going to use a very typical Australian excuse and blame politicians. My argument is that it's not that good ideas make for bad politics, but that bad politicians ignore good ideas and don't know how to communicate them effectively and don't try. I think that Australia may have more than our fair share of bad politicians. And by bad politicians, I mean people who pick whatever path is easier in the short term, even if it may have long-term costs, and the people who are unable or unwilling to make a case for ideas that are in the public interest, but that may be complicated to explain, that may have some short-term costs, or might be fiercely opposed by powerful vested interests. I think that we get a lot of political laziness in this country, and I actually ascribe at least part of that to the two-party system. I think that it would be, at least until this year's election, I think it would have been fair to characterise Australian politics as an uncompetitive duopoly. It's kind of like Woolies Coles, where the only competition is for swinging voters in marginal seats. And there's an economic principle called Hotelling's law, which the main metaphor used to describe this principle is the idea that you have two ice cream vendors on a beach. So you're down at Bondi Beach, it's crowded, there's people all the way along, you've got two ice cream vendors. The best way of serving all of the people on that beach who might want ice cream is to have one vendor 1/3 of the way along and the other vendor 2/3 of the way along. That's where it's closest to everybody. But there's always going to be a temptation for one of them to move that little bit further towards the middle, so they get all those people in between the flags. And if one of them starts doing that, well, the other one's more likely to start doing that because they don't want to miss out on the extra, ice cream buyers that the other one's getting. And so if that goes on, then what you end up with is two ice cream vendors side by side, smack bang in the middle of the beach, and a whole bunch of grumpy potential ice cream eaters who are frustrated they have to walk further away from their towel and their wallet and go and get their ice cream. And, citizens aren't customers. So imagine how much grumpier citizens get at this kind of behaviour, at that kind of, focus grouped, very, very marginal seat focused behaviour that we get out of our current two-party system. And, they really did kind of vote with their feet and, go up and get the ice cream from the place further up in, up towards Bondi. And I think that, that is something that is kind of proving that this kind of politics is a bit unsustainable. I think the other thing that influences this unwillingness to, I guess, have a bit of guts, take risks with ideas, not go for the safe route, and the lack of skill, I think, in explaining idea effectively, has something to do with pretty much the same thing that Donald Horne was talking about in the 60s when he wrote The Lucky Country. And, he was saying that we're basically a country with a lot of luck, but we're run by second-rate people who kind of coast on that luck. So a lot of you probably are familiar with the idea of the resource curse. So this is the idea that countries that are really rich in natural resources can actually end up being worse off in every other way. And that's partly because turning your country into a quarry hollows out the rest of the economy. But it's also partly about governance. When you've got a lot of dollars flowing in from your resource rents, it does take the pressure off to actually raise your government revenue from citizens, and therefore, because you're raising it from citizens, having to explain what it is you're doing with that money, how you're getting value for money out of what you're raising from them. I think it also, because, in Australia's situation, because it makes the headline GDP figures look good, there's less pressure to actually talk about the structural weaknesses in our economy, less pressure for there to be any kind of strategy or any kind of long-term economic vision. It takes pressure off government budgets, obviously, as we're seeing with the current debate over mining tax revenue and, whether that's going to mean our budget ends up in, a tiny deficit or slightly ahead. And that, as we saw really strongly during the Howard years, that means that you can use tax cuts and you can use handouts to buy continued support as a substitute for good ideas, as a substitute for more genuine and long-lasting investments. So our contention in this book that we published before the election this year, and actually we were planning a post-election edition as well, because we figure if politicians can get two bites out of the cherry by re-announcing the same programs multiple times, we've got this program, and we've also got this program in this seat, and we've also got this program in this marginal seat. It's the same program. We'll just put a new press release out. We figure if they can get away with that, we can do it too. So we're putting out a post-election updated print edition of More Than Luck, where the main argument is basically that this can't last. This situation that we're in, where both major parties think that they can get away with bagging the other side's ideas or lack of them and not actually putting up a positive vision for the future of this country themselves, that it just can't go on. It's politically unsustainable. I think we saw that with the record informal vote, as well as obviously Labor losing a large chunk of its base to the Greens. I thought it was quite interesting, actually, that one of the deciding factors in who was going to end up forming government was one of the few big ideas that actually did get put up and taken to this year's election, which was the National Broadband Network. And that ended up being a real deciding factor for the independents in who was going to form government. So there is a real political risk in not having good ideas now, I think. I think it's also politically unsustainable because I think people are onto it. In the lead up to this election, when the election debate was being planned, some of you probably remember that the timing of the televised debate got moved so that it wouldn't clash with the final of MasterChef. And I think there's good reason for that, actually. If you are facing a choice between watching two staged managed contests, where actually, the philosophies of cooking of Callum and Adam were probably more clearly defined than the political philosophies of Gillard and Abbott, why wouldn't you watch Callum and Adam instead of this, contest in which, the kind of the bullets from very small, the kind of very small bullets kind of ricochet off even smaller targets. It doesn't seem like a very, fun proposition. And if it is just a managerial contest, well, who wants to watch a battle between two middle managers? It's not great TV. It's unsustainable in a policy sense. So we've let ourselves coast on the back of past nation building for quite a long time. I'm just taking two really kind of core things that we expect governments to do, health and education. So our health system, we've let different past policy decisions kind of layer on top of each other in a sort of paper mache style fashion until it's kind of like this big piñata and everybody's waiting for somebody to bash it and for all the candy to fall out. The person who wrote the health chapter in our book described using our current health system with its incredible complexity of programs, trying to use that kind of a system to help manage people who have chronic illnesses, which is an increasing proportion of the people who need to use the health system, is a bit like trying to use typewriter to Twitter. It's an old tool, the way that we've built it. It does need really fundamental reform. And we put some ideas up in that chapter about how you might do that. There was an idea for a healthcare credit card so that you could actually deal with the really perverse system of co-payments. If you've ever gone to hospital and had a whole bunch of different invoices coming at you for weeks and months afterwards, then you'll know what I'm talking about. It's very hard to actually navigate what it is that you have to pay out of pocket with our current health system. So our idea was that you could actually make health expenses a lot easier to manage for most people by having the government pay the costs up front and then you pay it back in a HEC style scheme. So your minimum repayment to the government for your out-of-pocket health costs is actually capped according to your income. So it helps deal with the problem that actually it's a good idea to have people pay for some health expenses, but you don't want that to be unfair in terms of people's income and ability to pay. So that was just an idea, and we did actually, put that one up, and we'll be shopping that one around Canberra and, sending copies of the book off. So they're examples, I guess, of where, we've kind of let past nation-building exercises, gradually decay, I guess, in some ways, and we really need big ideas on how to turn that around. I guess the most obvious unsustainability of our current situation is the environmental unsustainability of where we've ended up. And you would think that actually preserving the environment that sustains us and, all of our activities as humans has got to be the best good idea of all. And actually the general public kind of agrees there. So Australia's been locked in a really artificial debate. It's kind of one of the few remaining ideological debates, and it's a false one. It's the idea that it's Greens versus jobs, and that the economy and the environment are somehow antithetical and separate from each other. And actually most people don't believe that. If you ask people to choose between two options. Do humans and jobs come before, the environment and animals? Well, people will, about 14% of people will choose that. If the second option is, does a strong economy depend on a healthy environment? 73% of people will choose that. It's kind of a no-brainer. And it's becoming more and more clear that, the various good ideas, I guess carbon price being one of the most obvious, are going to have to be acted on. We can't afford not to act on them. Those ideas are starting to be politically very powerful. I mean, you actually saw that the Rudd government really started dipping in the polls when it decided to walk away from a carbon price. I think the Gillard government got heavily punished for promising not to act. And, now actually they're doing a little bit better in the polls, and I think a lot of that is towards around the fact that they're actually looking like they're going to move forward even on the issue. Look, I think for a halfway decent politician, good ideas do equal good politics. There is an inherent appeal in a politician who actually has something serious to offer. But even if that weren't the case, the extent of the problems that we need to solve are going to force good ideas on Australian politics, and we're not going to be able to walk away from them.
So I think that's a perfect segue to our, as the author of The Rise of the Rudd-Bot and the Life and Adventures of Malcolm Turnbull, our expert on politicians. Annabelle.
Well, I just preface any stray remarks I might make about politicians by saying at times over the last nearly an hour, I've just almost felt like stabbing myself in the eye with depression. I mean, it's terrible. We're so bereft of ideas in this country, and poor Elizabeth can't find anyone to supervise her thesis, and Waleed can't bear to watch 24-hour news or read a poll story. And of course, you know, certain think tanks can't get more than 1.5 of their ideas implemented. It's dreadful, and here we are at the Opera House, an ugly, dreadful building it is, and, you know, nobody wants to talk about ideas except this packed room, and, you know, it's just awful. Honestly, look, one thing I think we do have to keep in mind with this discussion about ideas is that ideas are always much more ideal when they're in the ideal. I do find that this discussion can be very subjective, and that often when we're discussing why aren't there any big ideas anymore, what we actually mean is, why aren't my ideas being listened to? Because there's kind of an international conjugation of idea having and idea discussing going on here, and it's this. My idea is brave, visionary, insightful, and crucial. Your idea is housekeeping. And her idea is reckless adventurism. You know, so I think we do have to deal with the definitional problem here of what is a good idea, because to take a recent example, a recent 13-year example, the Howard government, now plenty of people, you know, you can make all sorts of accusations and allegations about the Howard government's years, and I think one that you couldn't make about it was that it was ideology-free. I think it was a highly ideological government, but yet it wouldn't necessarily satisfy the critics of ideas-free government to make that response, because then you get on to the discussion of whether or not they were good ideas, and then all of a sudden you realise that you're having a discussion about ideas, which is, I think, what we often were doing over the course of the Howard government. So anyway, that's my problem with the definitional parameters of this discussion. The most important idea to me in politics is that politicians should be courageous. I mean, I think that politicians, no matter what you think of their ideas, should be prepared to vocalise them. And I think we are getting into some strife on that front. I mean, politics is is the ultimate in outsourcing. You know, you and I outsource to politicians the task of spending money, collecting the money, the task of going to all of those formal functions that none of us could ever bear going to, and the task of setting some sort of direction for this country. And we reserve to ourselves, humbly, only the right of criticising every single thing they do. And I find that an incredibly agreeable equation. But once I've paid my money and voted and taken my seat in the press gallery so that I can rip the hell out of whatever it is they say and do, I do want them to say and do something that's reportable. For my purposes, which means pretty much the same as a voter's investment in it, something that's identifiable. And I think the definition of a courageous politician, for my money, is one who's prepared to take on their own interests in pursuit of an idea. And I think there are a few examples of that. I mean, one of the popular ones, I suppose, is the Hawke-Keating economic reforms, which took on the Labor constituency in pursuit of a of an ideal for the Australian economy. In the Howard government, you know, the one that most readily springs to mind for me is gun law reform, where you saw John Howard at one point being forced to strap on a bulletproof vest whilst attempting to explain the details of this policy to some of its key constituent stakeholders in the town of Sale. Now, perhaps Kevin Rudd would have done better had he worn a bulletproof vest more domestically. Anyway, look, I think that courage is key here, and one of the difficulties that we have in the field of courage in Australian politics, I think, is that we've sort of somehow managed to get leadership the wrong way around. And I think that the development of focus groups and the incredible detail with which professional people can research opinion in the Australian people, it's evolved to a point where politicians now, rather than, I think, honouring the equation and saying, well, you've outsourced to me, now I'm going to convince you, are kind of cribbing off cheat notes of like, well, if I were to say something courageous, what would you like it to be? There's a bit of that going on, I think. And part of it is because this focus group work is just so detailed now, and parties can afford it generally, that it's almost as though politicians are able to wean themselves off the task which we set them in the first place. So anyway, I'm aware we're actually already over the time a bit, aren't we? So shall I wrap up and then we can have a bit of discussion, or what's our...
As you can see, we have reached kind of the end of our time. We can probably do 5 minutes more. So a couple of minutes from Annabelle, but what I think would be great is if there is anybody who's got a burning question, we might be able to take one or two, provided we can do them quickly. Because
It'd be a pity to get out of this without having one contribution from the idea havers in the audience. I mean, I'm sure you're teeming.
So we'll give Annabelle a minute to wrap up, but please, I would love anybody who's going to be disappointed not to have their say this afternoon to maybe move to those microphones. Maybe if we can actually lift up the house lights so people can see their way to do that and we can see you, while Annabelle is giving us her punchline.
Oh, God. Talk about raising expectations.
with total justification, I'm sure.
Look, so I think that, that's better. It's nice to be able to see everybody. There really are people out there. I made that up before. So look, I think you've got this sort of backwards equation that happens sometimes. And the other thing is, and you know, Waleed actually said quite a bit of the stuff that I was thinking about saying about the media, which happily spares me from failing to invoke the Fifth Amendment in this instance. But I do think that we do, in the media, place a lot of demands on politicians to sort of fill space, and we get them on, right, OK, now you just talk for 10 minutes. And we force them to vocalise without really sort of saying anything because they haven't had enough time between breaks to reflect to the extent that they actually have something to say. I mean, I think that is a real problem. But one thing that I think is a great advance for the field of ideas, and I know I'm about to sound incredibly stupid and kind of basic here, but like the internet, I mean, it's an incredible means of hooking people with ideas up to each other and allowing them to talk quietly where they won't be bothered by anybody else, and then talking backwards and forwards to each other as well. I mean, I'm a big fan of Twitter, which is regularly dismissed as the most inane platform in the world. I disagree because I don't have to stop doing what I'm doing to just take a glance and see what other people are saying. The great thing about it is that it allows someone in a very short message to send a link to some fascinating article that somebody's written over the other side of the world, or, you know, the sort of thing that I wouldn't necessarily find myself if I hadn't gone looking. You know, I think that this is an incredibly valuable innovation, and I think that to worry that we don't invest enough in ideas in this society, I think, is to ignore the great revolution of ideas exchange online that we're sort of in the middle of. And I hope that an aberrant situation like the lower house of our parliament at the moment, which I've spent the last week interacting with rather interestingly, is a pretty good chance for ideas exchange as well. All of a sudden now we have this situation where anybody's legislation can make it onto the floor of the House and be debated. We have a situation where everybody's vote is worth an equal amount in the lower house. Never been the case before in my lifetime. And so all of a sudden MPs are responsible for their own ideas. I hope to God that this gives them a greater preparedness to vocalise them. The fact that all sorts of opinions are flying around emboldens those who are the members of major parties to do likewise. No punchline, sorry.
Like, if not a punchline, a very good concluding comment to me. We'll take one question from microphone 1 and one from microphone 2. Given our time of poverty, can I ask you to make those short, and if there's addressed to a particular person, to let us know who?
Sure. I just wanted to ask the panel what they thought about recent arguments of compulsory voting as opposed to optional voting, because some people have been suggesting that because we have compulsory voting in Australia, the major parties are really just pitching to a certain number of marginal seats, and in a way that kills ideas. And the argument with optional voting is that, at least in those countries that have optional voting, the parties can really pitch to people who will be engaged in politics and pitch the big ideas, or at least more so than in Australia. So I was just wondering what the panel thinks about that. Well, does compulsory voting kill ideas?
Well, I don't think so, no. With compulsory voting, people are compelled at least to pay attention, even nominally. I think that's useful. I've looked at election time at 2 other countries that have voluntary voting, being the USA and the UK. The USA seems to respond to voluntary voting by including more balloons at their campaign launches. I'm never sure quite. There was sort of like, we've got to catch your attention. Hello, we're going to do it with clickers, big signs. You know, it's brilliant. But then again, you still see particular attention paid to the swing states. I mean, really, politicians at campaign time will concentrate their efforts on the most valuable people who need to change their votes. In the UK, that happens too. I mean, you could live in seats that were safe constituencies either way and never even realise there was an election campaign going on. So they're a bit less cautious about their bring out the vote techniques in the UK, but I think it tends to work the same way even in voluntary voting areas.
Microphone 2.
Throughout the debate you're saying that there's no ideas going to our society early on about poor education system caused by only basic ideas, the lack of history that we study, such as the lack of history written on trade unionism or architecture, and because of this, opinions are hard to find, especially in party system. So what solutions could you find then to solve these issues?
Perhaps Elizabeth? We want to end on a note of optimism here.
Yeah, come on, Elizabeth, you identify the problem. You fix it.
Well, 2 comments. One is the education system is fundamental, absolutely fundamental, and of course it needs to recognise the importance of education across the board, but it also needs to recognise, for want of a better word, intelligence in kids, and that kids are not equal in that regard. We have to take that on board, just the same as not all kids can run fast or play cricket well. It is true, and it is valuable, and it is, if our future is going to be intelligent, we need to recognise that. And I don't mean selective schools, and the whole cramming system. I mean something that actually does what the selective school system says it does, which is try to find native intelligence rather than just cramming. I think that is fundamental, and I think it's possible, but we don't do it because that's not actually where our values lie. I had a dangerous idea to contribute to the voting franchise issue, which is, far from making it compulsory, I would actually restrict the right to vote. To people who actually could demonstrate that they knew something.
I can see a session for next year coming up. I'm afraid we've run out of time, and I'm very sorry. As you've demonstrated to us that not only are you interested in ideas enough to turn out on a Saturday afternoon to join us, but to respond to our speakers, I'd like to thank you, and I'd like to thank our speakers very much for coming. Elizabeth for her courage in the face of stupidity. Waleed, who you may not know, has written a thesis on Bohemian Rhapsody, so there's going to be a great bit more discussion going on there. Miriam, for raising the tone of the conversation to a level of optimism, and Annabelle for encouraging us to be a bit more assertive in the way we manage our outsourcing. If our politicians are bad, it's not just their fault. Thanks so much.